Saya berdiri di sini melalui PAN dan teman-teman di seluruh dunia sesama Partonun untuk bersuara lebih keras, mengembalikan semua hak kami atas karya-karya ini. Kita semua ini pasti terhubung. Seperti benang-benang kita yang panjang ini, kita pasti terhubung. Ini ada keterhubungan di antara kita semua, di antara alam kita semua. Kita pasti terhubung. Dan sudah waktunya kita sadar keterhubungan kita semua ini. Demikian yang bisa saya sampaikan. Mau lihat Horace.
I'm deeply struck by Uli's words at the end of the film, where she urges us to be aware that we're all connected, just like the warp yarns in her textiles. She speaks to all of us when she says that. She appeals to our common humanity. You see from this that she has a sense of the oneness of the world. She assumes that there's a universal ethic of caring, and that if people only knew, they wouldn't allow her and other weavers to suffer oppression and lose their traditions and their connection with nature. If she could only convey how special it is, we would all stand with her. I'm touched by her belief in our collective goodness, and I wonder if it's a product of the thought world surrounding her ancient weaving practice. Most of us have been unconsciously shaped by a very different tradition, the fashion industry. Clothing is a human universal, but fashion is specific to only some cultures. Even though the industry has globalized, it still splits the world into those with and those without fashion, and with fashion comes power and wealth. We've all become victims of this split in some way or another. The fashion tradition divides and it blinkers. And it's huge. It has spread into every corner of the globe and employs 60 to 70 million garment workers. One man benefits the most from the fashion system, and that's the head of LVMH, the largest fashion holding company in the world. In 2021, he was the richest person in the world. And then there's Uli, who's hurt and ignored by that same system. She represents Indigenous makers of clothing everywhere. Now, there's a fairness discourse within fashion, and it focuses on the circumstances of garment workers, primarily their pay and working conditions. I think this film shows us that this discourse needs to be expanded to include makers of Indigenous clothing, because they're also suffering as a consequence of the fashion system. So why are we only talking about garment workers? We need to de-erase Indigenous systems in the discussion of fashion and bring them back into view. Instead of erasing them, they need to be honored. They represent alternatives to the fashion system, and that is precisely what fashion reformers are looking for now. So these Indigenous garment makers need room to survive. Well, you might counter that the fashion industry is increasingly celebrating artisanal craft, but surely this film reveals that this recognition reduces Indigenous traditions to mere techniques in support of the industry. To treat holistic, complex, and independent traditions as sources of techniques is no different than treating them as sources of design to plunder. It's yet another strategy of erasure, and it may provide some with income, but it does not support Indigenous traditions. To the contrary, it expands the reach of the fashion industry. So this film offers a small glimpse into how fashion erodes the value of Indigenous clothing, ideologically, technologically, politically, and economically. It depicts coloniality at work. Many people believe that Indigenous worlds are bound to disappear, that it's inevitable. But Uli tells us that the disappearance of her weaving tradition is a consequence of multiple factors. including modern education, the power of fashion, and government policy that favors industrial initiatives. The disappearance of her tradition is not inevitable. It's a matter of choice. Another thing that we learned from this film is that the fashion discourse is insufficient when it focuses solely on the industry itself. Fashion is significantly and also tragically more than the normalized definition of style change through time. It's also about all of the impacts of the industry in the world and the people who are perceived as not having fashion. And then there's the issue of sustainability. The film shows that the discourse about sustainability that's conducted within the world of fashion is also too narrow. It emphasizes materials. But sustainability is not just about whether your shirt was made with cotton or synthetic fiber. Sustainability is also about whether all of fashion's processes will allow people like Uli to continue to have access to the natural materials that they need to perpetuate their weaving tradition. I was just learning that the Amazon rainforest is being cleared to grow so-called sustainable cotton. To be effective, the discourse needs to be expanded to include the relations between people and the natural world. We propose that a pluriverse of clothing traditions replace the current dominance of the monolithic fashion industry. We would prefer to see many traditions, all of which are local, historically grounded, sustainable, and respected. The clothing pluriverse includes all of the clothing traditions in the world and throughout time. And that's when it really hits home, what an immense sacrifice the fashion system is making when it erases indigenous clothing cultures. Uli's clothing tradition, like the title of the film says, is part of the sacrifice zone of fashion. So let's go back to connectedness for a minute. Uli is convinced that if we were conscious of the fact that we're all connected, this would make all the difference. And I agree. I think this idea is central. If we're all connected, we're going to care for one another. And caring is radical. It has the power to shift our view of the world and how we perceive our position in it. It would inevitably change our definition of fashion and how we study it. It would engender new urgency in promoting fairness in fashion. Uli's tradition is hanging by a thread. It would enable us to see the divide between the global North and the global South for what it is, a colonial illusion maintained for the benefit of those with fashion, wealth, and power. Perceiving the connectedness among all of us means that we're all Uli, and Uli is all of us. Uli's last word in the film is horas. This is a Batak word, and the way the Batak people express their wish for well-being for all. We need to aim for clothing systems that offer that to her and all of us.